Stop viewing your psychological vulnerability as a virtue. It is not morality. It is a clinical diagnosis of profound psychic failure. If you insist on maintaining the delusion that the world operates on principles of reciprocal loyalty and innate human goodness, you are committing psychological suicide, slow and deliberate. The cold, hard truth, the kind that cuts through the sentimental fog of modern neurosis, is that you do not fear the external enemy enough, but you fear the internal darkness too much. You have built an elaborate psychic defense system against your own capacity for destruction, your own shadow, and in doing so, you have rendered yourself structurally incapable of recognizing that same darkness when it is projected perfectly onto the faces of those closest to you. Machiavelli, crude as his language may have been, was observing a fundamental psychological law, the necessity of seeing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. The individual who wishes to make a profession of goodness is not a saint. He is an incomplete human structure. He is the man who has failed the primary task of individuation, the integration of the shadow. He has denied the violent, chaotic, and self-serving instincts that form the bedrock of the human psyche. When you repress these contents, they do not vanish. They become autonomous complexes. They gain power in the unconscious and are immediately projected onto others. This is why betrayal is never a surprise to the objective analyst, only to the patient suffering from chronic naivete. You trust the person pouring your wine because you have successfully convinced yourself that you are incapable of poisoning it. Therefore, by extension of your grand projection, they must also be incapable. This insistence on externalizing all potential malice is the very mechanism that makes you a casualty. You are walking through a psychological landscape littered with traps, yet you refuse to carry a lantern because you demand that every path be paved with sunshine and goodwill. This is not bravery. It is a fatal intellectual laziness. We are not discussing toxic relationships or the superficiality of setting boundaries. Those are the weak modern terms used by people who refuse to look into the abyss. The problem is not the external relationship. The problem is the internal structure of the victim. If your persona, that social mask you wear, is built solely on the need for approval, if you sacrifice your own authentic psychic integrity simply to avoid the fardeau of honest confrontation, then you have created a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and psychic parasites, the complexes autonomos of others, will rush in to fill it. The vast majority of humanity operates in this state of chronic neurosis. They are the massa, the psychological sleepwalkers. They are not consciously evil. They are merely unconscious, driven by primitive instincts and societal programming. They are the 90% who will be devoured, not by a grand enemy, but by the relentless, predictable mechanics of the collective unconscious. Their betrayal is not a moral failing. It is a predictable physical reaction, like a chemical compound reacting to heat. The danger of the fake friend is precisely that they act as a mirror, reflecting the repressed contents you desperately tried to deny. When the person you helped gets you fired, they are acting out the repressed envy and competitive instinct that you yourself suppressed in order to maintain the facade of pure, unblemished goodwill. Your success generates a psychological pressure point, a gap, and their zero-sum ego compels them to close that gap. For them, your rise is an objective threat to their subjective feeling of worth. It is arithmetic, not morality. Envy is the most dangerous psychological poison because it operates in silencio. Anger is loud and easily identified. It is a complex that screams. Envy, however, is a complex that whispers, burrowing deep into the unconscious, often disguised as admiration or subservience. The fake friend will praise you in public, but the lack of genuine warmth in their eyes is the microscopic signal that the internal psychic knife is being sharpened. They are not celebrating your success. They are calculating its cost to them and devising a strategy for its neutralization. This is the grim reality you must face. You are being measured. Your kindness is not being accepted as a gift. It is being weighed against its market value in a transaction driven by instinctual greed. If you continue to believe that every hand extended is offered in genuine friendship, you are not kind. You are merely psychologically unarmed. You have failed to integrate the necessary aggression, the capacity for ruthless observation and self-defense that is vital for survival in the objective reality of the human psyche. To survive the wolves, You must first acknowledge the wolf within yourself. You must accept the pasiao, sacrifice, the killing of the part of you that craves universal approval. That part is the psychological deadweight that keeps you exposed. The minute you embrace the cold necessity of seeing the world exactly as it is, brutal, mechanical, and driven by self-interest, you cease to be a sheep. You become something else, something capable of enduring the solidão and the fardo of true consciousness. This is the first step toward being individuation, and it requires you to stand alone against the comforting lie of the massa. If you are not prepared to see the sombra in others, it means you have not dared to look at your own, and those contents, repressed and denied, will always find their external agent of expression. The betrayal is not something done to you. It is something that happens through you, facilitated by your own structural weakness. You must wake up from this collective neurotic sleep before the execution is complete. We are not observing a healthy society that occasionally encounters bad luck. We are diagnosing a structural failure of the psyche, an epidemic of Xiao, neurosis. The pervasive feeling of exhaustion, the quiet desperation that blankets the modern landscape, is not simple physical fatigue. It is the signature of a soul running on fumes, a direct consequence of a life lived fundamentally against the grain of objective reality. This is the neurosis of compliance, the sickness born from an attempt to exist entirely within the confines of the persona. The modern individual is convinced that if they meticulously follow the social script, if they are kind, loyal, successful, and politically correct, they will be rewarded with safety and contentment. They believe that doing everything right is a form of psychological insurance. This belief is a catastrophic delusion, a profound misunderstanding of human instinct and the brutal mechanics of the use in conscientiu. What happens when the ego identifies absolutely with the persona? The persona is, by definition, a necessary compromise, a social mask. But when the mask becomes the face, the authentic self, the raw, instinctual life, is shoved into the cellar of the mind, into the guerra sombra. This is the critical moment of a repression. You are not eradicating the uncomfortable, self-interested, or aggressive elements of your character. You are merely giving them autonomy. They are not destroyed. They are transformed into independent entities, into complexos autonomos. These complexos autonomos are the psychological equivalent of internal saboteurs. They are fragments of the personality that have been denied consciousness, yet they retain immense psychic energy. They wait for the moment of vulnerability to seize control, often manifesting externally through projection. The reason your meticulously constructed life is failing, the reason the friend you elevated is now trying to slit your throat, is that your own internal structure is fundamentally unstable. You have built a beautiful house on a foundation of lies. The external betrayal you fear is nothing more than a precise mirror, reflecting the internal betrayal you have committed against yourself. You have refused the difficult, lifelong fardo of Sas individuation, the process of integrating the shadow and becoming whole. Instead, you opted for the easy path, universal likability, the comfortable lie of the amasa hami, and the price of that comfort is your vulnerability. When Machiavelli observed that he who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived, he was speaking a cold, hard psychological truth. The deceiver finds a victim whose internal defenses are non-existent because they have projected their capacity for ruthlessness onto the external world. You see the friend as purely good because you refuse to acknowledge the manipulative capacity within yourself. Your blindness is not an act of virtue. It is a structural weakness, a denial of the abismo that resides in every human heart. The person who refuses to integrate their own necessary aggression, their capacity for critical judgment and self-defense, is psychologically unarmed. They are an open target. They mistake their own naivete for goodness. This is why the betrayal feels like an execution, not a battle. The battle was lost years ago, when you chose to repress the vital components of your lexique in favor of social acceptance. You created a vacuum, and the external world, driven by instinctual greed and the zero-sum ego, simply filled it. To reverse this course, to stop this slow-motion ruinas requires a brutal surgical intervention. You must stop viewing human relationships through the lens of morality, and start viewing them through the lens of objective cause and effect. Men are not inherently loyal. They are driven by perceived necessity and the immediate need for gain. Your kindness, divorced from rigorous critical observation, is not a virtue. It is a psychological liability that will be exploited. The path forward demands the complete sacrifice of the naive self. You must embrace the solidon that comes with true consciousness. The moment you truly see the world, not as you wish it were, but as a mechanism driven by power, self-interest, and the constant threat of the complexos autonomos, projecting themselves into the social sphere, you will be exiled from the comforting illusion of the massa. This is the price of psychic survival. Stop seeking validation. Stop performing the persona. Start the agonizing work of integrating the sombra. So, look into the darkness you have denied, because only by owning your own capacity for destruction and manipulation can you develop the psychological apparatus necessary to recognize it in others. If you continue to sleep, clinging to the childish fantasy that everyone has a good heart, the knife is already descending. Wake up. The diagnosis is severe and the cure is painful, but the alternative is complete psychological suicide. This is not a matter of setting boundaries. This is a matter of survival in the objective reality of the human condition. We must now dissect the essential error that leaves the individual utterly vulnerable to the Machiavellian maneuver, the failure to understand the mechanics of their own public face. We are not talking about simple hypocrisy. We are talking about a structural flaw in the human psyche, the deadly mechanism known as the persona. The persona is the mask, the provisional identity adopted by the ego to navigate the demands of the collective. It is, ostensibly, a necessary compromise, the agreed-upon role we play in society, the loyal friend, the diligent employee, the moral citizen. But understand this clearly: the persona is not the self. It is merely the frontier between the ego and the world. It is a psychological structure built primarily of expectations, titles, and social conventions. When the persona functions correctly, it is a flexible tool. But in the modern epidemic of neurosis, it has become a rigid, suffocating suit of armor. The great psychological danger, the one that makes you a casualty waiting to happen, is not that you wear the mask, but that you become pathologically identified with it. When a man believes absolutely and without question that he is the kind, generous, trustworthy individual portrayed by his persona, he has committed an act of psychological suicide. He has severed his connection to the objective reality of his own internal landscape. This identification is a catastrophic error because the psyche operates on the principle of compensation. Every quality ruthlessly excluded from the conscious ego's definition of the self does not vanish. It is merely relegated to the darkness of the inconscient soul. This is the birth of the sombra. The more brilliant, saintly, and perfect the persona shines in the public sphere, the deeper and more potent the sombra grows in the subterranean chambers of the mind. If the conscious ego insists, "I am good, loyal, and pure," the sombra is simultaneously accumulating all the denied material: the envy, the greed, the pettiness, the capacity for cold, calculated betrayal, all the precise, brutal instincts Machiavelli identified as inherent in the human animal. This repressed content does not remain dormant. It gains autonomy. It organizes itself into complexos autonomos, fragments of the psyche that possess their own destructive will, acting independently of the conscious ego. This is why you see the most outwardly pious individuals suddenly collapsing into ruinous scandals, or the loyal friend committing the most vicious act of sabotage. The internal pressure generated by the lie, the fardo of maintaining the perfect persona, eventually cracks the structure. The tragedy is that the individual, trapped within this rigid mask, cannot acknowledge the existence of their own darkness. The conscious ego screams, "Not me, I am good." Therefore, the sombra must find expression externally. It is projected. The man identified with his flawless persona cannot see his own capacity for treachery, so he sees it everywhere else. He becomes paranoid, or conversely, he becomes pathologically naive, assuming that everyone else must be as pure as the mask he wears. This is why he who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. The victim, clinging desperately to their own shining persona of trust and goodwill, projects that expectation onto the deceiver. They refuse to see the cold, hard truth staring them in the face, because acknowledging the betrayal in the world would mean acknowledging the potential for betrayal within themselves. They cannot afford the sacrificio of their own self-image. When you look at the fake friend, the Machiavellian operator, who is measuring your kindness against a market value, understand that they too are trapped within a structural lie. Their persona, perhaps the helpful mentor or the sympathetic confidant, is merely the camouflage for a highly charged complexo autonomo driven by envy and the need for control. They are not acting from a place of conscious wickedness. They are frequently acting out the demands of their own unintegrated sombra. They betray you not just because you are in the way, but because their own internal reservoir of denied malice needs an outlet. The betrayal is a form of psychological displacement. It is much easier for them to attack your reputation or undermine your success than to confront the abyssal emptiness and gnawing envy that their rigid persona was built to hide. They are performing a psychological cleansing ritual, projecting the dirt onto you so they can continue to feel clean. This is the grim arithmetic of social interaction. Those who refuse the agonizing work of individuation, the integration of the sombra, are condemned to interact with the world through a thick veil of projection. They are blind, and the blind are easy prey. Or worse, they are the predators driven by contents they do not own. To survive the wolves, you must first acknowledge the wolf within your own breast. You must kill the part of you that insists on the comforting lie of the perfect persona. This is the essential step for developing the critical observation necessary to spot the glitches in the matrix, the subtle, microscopic signals that reveal the true intent of the deceiver. If you continue to cling to the illusion that you are purely good, you will forever be vulnerable to the projected evil of others, precisely because you have failed to prepare your psychological defenses. You must shed the innocence. You must embrace the solidome of the conscious observer. Stop waiting for the catastrophe. The psychological autopsy must begin now, before the knife descends and your tseek suffers complete ruina. We must now turn the analytical scalpel toward the observer himself. Stop looking outward, waiting for the external enemy to define your suffering. That is the fundamental psychological trap, the neurosis of modern man, the insistence on externalizing the cause of internal malaise. The cold, hard truth, the one that guarantees a profound and necessary psychological shock, is this: the villain in your story is often merely your own repressed self, projected onto the stage of the world. If you are perpetually betrayed, if the knife finds your back with predictable regularity, you must cease the childish whining of victimization and perform a rigorous clinical examination of your own seek. You are not an innocent bystander in this carnage. You are complicit. Machiavelli understood that deception requires permission. Psychologically, this permission is granted by the persona's desperate need to maintain its pristine, artificial structure. Why do we project the evil outside? Because the integration of the sombra, the confrontation with our own capacity for envy, aggression, manipulation, and self-interest, is the most terrifying and demanding work of individuation. It is easier, infinitely easier, to point a finger at the fake friend and declare, "You are the treacherous one," than to stare into the psychological abyss and admit, "I possess the exact same capacity for treachery, and my failure to acknowledge it made me blind." The fake friend, the betrayer, serves a grim but essential function in the economy of your self-deception. They become the refuse bin for all the unacceptable contents of your own inconscience soul. When you see their calculation, their cold arithmetic, their zero-sum ego, you are seeing the raw, unadulterated instinctual drives that you have spent a lifetime attempting to repress and cloak in the comfortable fabric of morality and kindness. You despise their ruthlessness because it is the mirror image of the ruthless survival mechanism within you that you refuse to activate or even acknowledge. This refusal to look inward is not merely a moral failing, it is a profound structural weakness in the seek. It creates a state of psychological permeability. You are walking through the world with no internal defenses because you have externalized the threat. You build walls against the stranger, but you lower the bridge for the deceiver because the deceiver offers precisely the validation, the false intimacy, or the comforting sense of superiority that your fragile persona demands. The fake friend hooks into your complexes, the need to be liked, the fear of solidon, the insatiable hunger for affirmation, and uses them as levers. When the betrayal occurs, The subsequent mental breakdown is not just the result of external damage, it is the catastrophic failure of the internal defensive system. The moment you realize you have been sleeping next to a snake, the primary shock is not the loss of the relationship, but the agonizing realization of your own self-imposed blindness. You allowed yourself to be deceived because the illusion was safer than the truth. The only way to develop the critical observation necessary to spot the subtle, microscopic signals of the deceiver is to first become intimately acquainted with the deceiver within. You must perform the sacrificio of the innocent self. You must kill the part of you that believes everyone has a good heart, because that belief is a psychological sedative that leads directly to ruina. It is a sign of arrested development, a refusal to accept the brutal physics of human nature. Machiavelli did not offer moral advice. He offered descriptive science on the mechanics of power and survival. He observed that men are driven by instinct, not by abstract loyalty. The fake friend operates on this level of necessity. If you operate on the level of sentimental morality, you will always be outmaneuvered. To neutralize the psychological threat, you must integrate the capacity for ruthlessness and cold calculation into your own conscious awareness. I am not suggesting you become a sociopath. I am demanding that you become a conscious human being. You must own your sombra so that its contents cease to operate autonomously through projeção. When you integrate your shadow, two crucial things happen. 1. The projection ceases. You stop seeing the external world through the distorted lens of your own repressed contents. You can see the fake friend not as a demonic entity, but as a damaged individual driven by their own complexos autonomos. Envy, inferiority, the compulsion to control. 2. The immunity factor. The deceiver's tactics stop working because they are designed to exploit your psychological weaknesses. If you have integrated the need for power, flattery, and self-interest, you are no longer easily manipulated by someone offering those things falsely. You become a mirror they cannot bear to look into. They seek victims who are psychologically soft, who are desperate for the lie. When they encounter someone who has done the agonizing internal work, they withdraw, sensing the cold, impenetrable structure of a unified seek. This process requires profound solido. You must step away from the comforting consensus of the massa that insists on the narrative of external blame. This is the ultimate fardo of consciousness. You alone are responsible for the contents you carry and the consequences of your blindness. Do not ask, "What did I do wrong to deserve this betrayal?" Ask instead, "What aspect of my own unintegrated sombra did I project onto this individual, thereby creating the psychological opening for their complexos autonomos to penetrate my defenses?" The failure is not moral, it is analytical. It is a failure of consciousness. Wake up. The clock is ticking on this collective neurose. The modern world is drowning in sentimental illusions and projecting its internal chaos onto political enemies, social scapegoats, and the fake friends at the table. If you want to survive the brutal mechanics of human interaction, you must shed the innocence. Embrace the darkness within and see the world exactly as it is. A dangerous system populated by autonomous complexes, where the greatest threat is always the one you refuse to acknowledge within your own breast. Stop waiting for the catastrophe. The psychological autopsy is already underway, and the first corpse on the slab is the illusion of your own perfect goodness. The psychological autopsy demands a complete restructuring of the living subject. We have diagnosed the epidemic of neurose that makes modern man susceptible to the fake friend, the refusal to confront the internal abyss. The cure, predictably, is not pleasant. It is not about setting boundaries or cutting out toxic people. That is merely rearranging the furniture while the foundation collapses. The true remedy is individuação, and it requires a sacrificio of the most cherished illusion, the belief in your own perfect goodness. To survive the wolves, you must know the wolf within. The cold, hard truth is that the external betrayer is merely the shadow cast by your own unacknowledged capacity for malice. When you repress your darker instincts, your envy, your aggression, your potential for ruthlessness, you do not destroy them, you merely render them autonomous. These contents become complexos autonomos that seek expression. Where do they find it? They find it through projeção. You unconsciously cast your own darkness onto others, trusting the seemingly benevolent individual whom you have psychologically sanitized. You trust the fake friend precisely because you have projected your sombra onto them, believing they carry the burden of your own repressed negativity. This is why betrayal feels like an execution, not a battle. It is the return of the repressed, delivered by the agent you empowered. The process of individuation requires you to pull the sombra back. You must look into that mirror and acknowledge with brutal honesty that you too are capable of the same calculating coldness, the same zero-sum arithmetic, and the same quiet envy that motivates the betrayer. This is not a moral failure, it is a psychological necessity. Only by integrating this darkness, not acting it out but knowing it, can you terminate the projection and see the individual sitting across from you not as a moral paragon, but as a dangerous system of instincts and autonomous complexes. Just like yourself, you are not integrating this sombra to become a villain. You are integrating it to become psychologically whole. A unified seek is the only true defense against manipulation. When you stop denying your own darkness, you stop being fooled by the light show of others. Once this integration begins, the practical defenses fall into place naturally. We call this strategic posture the holy indifference. It is not apathy. It is the clinical recognition that the emotional dramas of the external world, the praise, the slander, the envy, the sudden kindness, are often just noise generated by the unexamined seek of the massa. The individual who has undertaken the fardo of consciousness learns to observe these dynamics with the quiet detachment of a scientist observing bacteria in a petri dish. When the fake friend attempts to apply pressure through subtle insults, calculated dependency, or manufactured crisis, the integrated individual does not react emotionally. They do not feed the complex. They simply observe the mechanism at work. This leads directly to the ultimate defensive weapon, strategic silencio. The complexos autonomos thrive on reaction. They need the fuel of your anxiety, your defense, or your moral outrage to maintain their energy. When the betrayer offers the bait, a passive-aggressive comment, a deliberate undermining of your work, a sudden, insincere flattery, your instinct is to engage, to justify, or to fight back. This is the mistake. By employing strategic silencio, you deny the complex the energy it requires. You become a mirror that reflects the aggressor's own content back onto them, without distortion or judgment. The fake friend, operating from a place of chronic internal division and neurose, cannot tolerate this unflinching reflection. They crave conflict, which validates their own internal chaos. When they meet silence and indifference, they are forced to confront the void within themselves. This is why the analyst must remain silent during critical moments. Silence is not weakness, it is psychological surgery. It forces the contents of the inconscious to surface in the other person, often causing intense discomfort, anxiety, and eventually withdrawal. The integrated individual does not engage in petty warfare. They simply allow the fake friend to become transparent. You do not neutralize them by fighting. You neutralize them by refusing to be fooled. When the schemer realizes that their manipulative machinery is fully visible, that their smile is being measured against their eyes, they will instinctively retreat. They are desperate for victims who live in the comfortable fog of illusion, not for those who carry the cold clarity of consciousness. This path, however, ensures profound solidum. Individuation is a solitary enterprise. The moment you achieve this psychological integrity, you separate yourself from the comforting consensus of the massa. The massa requires simple narratives, good versus evil, victim versus aggressor. The integrated person sees only psychological systems interacting. This separation makes you alien to the collective. You become the outsider, the one who sees too much. This is the ultimate fardo. You will lose the childish comfort of believing that the world is populated by loyal, grateful, morally consistent actors. You must accept that human nature, as Machiavelli observed, is fundamentally driven by necessity, fear, and gain, and that this reality applies to everyone, including yourself. Stop waiting for the catastrophe to validate your analysis. The work must be done now, in the chilling quiet of self-examination. The modern world is suffering from a collective failure of nerve, a refusal to accept the reality of the internal sombra. This refusal is paying the psychological piper in the form of widespread neurose and relentless betrayal. If you are unwilling to perform the necessary sacrificio, to kill the part of you that insists on innocence and externalizes blame, then you are already a casualty of your own blindness. The true crisis is not the friend with the knife. The crisis is the soft, unexamined psychological structure that opened the gate for them. Wake up. The time for sentimentality is over. The only way out of this psychological prison is through the dark, cold door of self-knowledge. See the world for the brutal, objective system it is, and fortify your seek against the inevitable onslaught of the autonomous complexes, both within and without. We have performed the psychological autopsy. We have dissected the anatomy of betrayal, not through the lens of morality or sentiment, but through the cold, objective mechanics of the seek and the brutal realities observed by Machiavelli. The diagnosis is complete. Now comes the prognosis, and it offers no comfort. The knowledge you now possess, the ability to identify the glitches in the matrix, to see the complexos autonomos projected onto the faces of those who smile at you, is not a shield. It is a clinical burden, a fardo that demands a severe choice. You stand at a precipice facing a binary question that defines your entire existence: consciousness or ruin. There is no middle ground. The great majority of humanity chooses ruin, cloaked in the comforting delusion of innocence. They insist on believing that the world is inherently good, that loyalty is a default setting, and that betrayal is an aberration caused by bad people. This is the psychological suicide of the modern age. It is the refusal to accept the sombra, the repressed, dangerous, instinctual contents that drive human action. When you refuse to acknowledge the wolf within yourself, you are guaranteed to project that wolf onto the external world, thereby rendering yourself incapable of recognizing the genuine threat when it sits across your table. This refusal to see the objective reality of the pasik is the root of mass neurose. The fake friend is not the primary problem. The primary problem is the soft, unexamined psychological structure that invited the parasite in. The moment you prioritize comfort over truth, you become psychologically compromised. You sacrifice the capacity for individuation, the painful process of integrating your totality, or the cheap, temporary anesthetic of social acceptance. That acceptance is purchased with your own vulnerability, and the price is always paid in blood. If you choose the path of ruin, you remain locked in the collective sleep. You will continue to react to events rather than understand their underlying causes. You will suffer recurrent betrayals, not because you are unlucky, but because your internal psychological architecture is flawed, lacking the necessary walls and fortifications. You will continue to ask, "Why me?" when the more accurate question is, "Why did I allow this autonomous complex to dominate my judgment?" You remain a victim of external circumstance because you refuse to assume responsibility for your internal landscape. This is the cold, hard truth. The knife that kills you is forged in your own repressed material. If you choose consciousness, you choose pain. You choose the necessary sacrificio. You must kill the part of you that craves validation, that requires external approval to feel whole. You must accept the profound solidon that comes with seeing the world exactly as it is, a system driven by necessity, fear, and the relentless pursuit of gain, where human relationships are often transactions veiled in sentimentality. This is not cynicism. This is clinical realism. To survive, you must become surgical. You must treat your relationships not as moral playgrounds, but as fields of psychological force. You must fortify your seek so thoroughly that the autonomous complexes, both those operating within your own unconscious and those projected by others, cannot find a weakness. This means developing an inner structure so robust and self-contained that the need for external validation withers and dies. When you stop needing others to affirm your existence, you become immune to the manipulations of those who thrive on dependency and control. The modern epidemic of betrayal is simply a reflection of the collective failure to perform this internal work. Society is drowning in a sea of unexamined lives, where individuals are driven by raw instinct and desperate repression. They construct fragile personas, masks of virtue and competence, that inevitably crack under the slightest pressure. The fake friend is often just a mirror reflecting the unintegrated sombra of the collective. They betray because their own internal structure is collapsing, and they seek to stabilize themselves by siphoning psychological energy from a weaker host. It is psychological arithmetic, not malice. The time for sentimentality is over. The time for setting boundaries is over. Those are conversations for the psychologically naive. This is about survival. You must stop believing in the illusion of inherent goodness and start analyzing the mechanics of human behavior with the precision of a physicist examining a collapsing star. You cannot afford to wait for the catastrophe. The work must be done now, in the chilling silence of self-confrontation. Look at your own need for approval. Examine the contents you habitually repress. Where are your own autonomous complexes lurking? Because until you integrate your own capacity for betrayal, you will remain perpetually blind to the same capacity in others. The path of individuation is a brutal ascent, demanding that you face the abysmo of your own nature. But it is the only path that offers genuine psychological sovereignty. The alternative is the slow, grinding ruina of the self, constantly being undone by the very people you allowed into your inner sanctuary. So here is the ultimatum. Are you ready to assume the fardeau of consciousness, accepting the profound loneliness and the painful truth that human nature is an inherently dangerous system? Or will you retreat back into the comfortable lie, allowing your seek to be dismantled piece by the unexamined complexes of the massa? The choice is yours. But understand this, once you choose the painful truth, you can never go back to the illusion. You must become the cold observer, the detached analyst, the one who sees the gears turning beneath the skin. Get your house in order. Fortify your structure. The world is not waiting for you to be ready. For those few willing to step out of the collective neuros and face the objective reality of the human seek, the serious work begins now. Insist on the truth. Insist on the difficult scientific path of self-knowledge. Anything less is a compromise with your own destruction.